The winter of 1816 was never supposed to exist. That's what makes it so unsettling. No volcano in living memory, no recorded celestial event that should have darkened the skies that year, and yet the sun dimmed, the temperatures collapsed, and summer simply vanished. Crops failed in June, snow fell in July, rivers froze in August. Across Europe and North America, people wrote the same words in diaries they never expected to write. The cold does not end, but buried beneath those familiar accounts of famine and frost is something far stranger, something most historians never mention, because it doesn't fit the narrative of hardship and recovery. During that impossible winter, bodies were found in the ice, not animals, not soldiers, not peasants, bodies that were too large to explain, too well preserved to dismiss, and too quickly removed to investigate. Giants, frozen where they fell, uncovered briefly by a world already struggling to survive, then erased as quietly as the sun itself had dimmed. What most people don't realize is that the year without a summer coincides almost perfectly with the last credible physical discoveries of abnormally large human remains in Europe and North America. Before 1816, reports of giants appear regularly in local records, parish notes, and early scientific journals. After 1816, those reports change in tone, then frequency, then disappear altogether. The timing is not subtle, it is sharp, abrupt, as if something crossed a threshold, as if whatever had existed alongside ordinary humanity could no longer survive the new conditions imposed on the world. And the cold didn't just kill crops, it didn't just starve populations, it froze entire truths in place, locking them in ice long enough to be briefly seen before being buried again, this time under official silence. In the Alpine regions, particularly in Switzerland and northern Italy, accounts from the years immediately following 1816 describe excavation crews uncovering enormous human forms preserved in glacial melt zones. These were not skeletons scattered by time. These were intact bodies, skin darkened but present, limbs proportioned far beyond normal human scale. Local physicians were called. Measurements were taken. Some of those measurements survive in private letters and forgotten medical ledgers, describing heights exceeding 8 feet, shoulders broader than door frames, hands too large to fit standard manacles. But these records were never published in mainstream scientific journals. Instead, they were classified as curiosities, anomalies of nature, or quietly handed off to state authorities who ensured they would not circulate further. What makes frozen discoveries different from skeletal finds is preservation. Bones can be dismissed, they can be misidentified, fragmented, reclassified. But frozen flesh tells a different story. Muscle mass, organ size, proportions that cannot be explained away by disease without leaving pathological markers. And that is precisely why frozen giants present a problem. They are harder to reinterpret, harder to erase, which may explain why so few images, drawings, or detailed anatomical studies of these bodies survive. Not because they were never documented, but because documentation itself became dangerous. In 1817, a journal entry from a Bavarian naturalist mentions being summoned to examine a colossal human cadaver recovered from receding ice. The entry ends abruptly. The following pages are missing. The next surviving entry resumes months later, discussing plant die-off and livestock mortality, with no mention of the body. The handwriting changes slightly. Scholars attribute this to damage or loss, but the pattern repeats across regions. Mentions begin, measurements are noted, then silence, as if someone intervened between observation and publication, redirecting attention back to famine, back to cold, back to survival, away from the implications of what had been found. And those implications are staggering. If giants existed in sufficient numbers to be frozen in place by a sudden climatic catastrophe, then their disappearance was not mythological or ancient. It was recent, shockingly recent, close enough that they were still sharing the same world, the same infrastructure, the same cities as ordinary humans, which raises a question that history refuses to answer. What happens to a large-bodied population when the environment suddenly collapses? Smaller humans can survive on less food. They require fewer calories. They adapt faster to scarcity. Giants would not. A global temperature drop, crop failure, and mass starvation would hit them first, hardest, and fastest. The year without a summer may not have been just a disaster. It may have been an extinction event, not for humanity as a whole, but for a specific class of humans whose physiology made them incompatible with the new world that emerged afterward. And if that's true, then the frozen giants were not anomalies. They were casualties, the last visible remnants of a population that could not survive the reset. But extinction alone does not explain the disappearance of the bodies themselves, because bodies leave evidence, graves, records, museums, yet almost none exist. The few that were reportedly recovered were quickly claimed by authorities, transported to unknown locations, or lost during institutional transfers. In several cases, military involvement is mentioned explicitly. Soldiers dispatched not to secure food or maintain order, but to control sites where unusual remains were found. Why would starving governments allocate resources to retrieve frozen corpses unless those corpses represented something they could not allow to become public knowledge? Consider the timing again. 1816 does not just mark climatic collapse. It marks a turning point in historical narrative. Within decades, maps change. Tartaria fades from atlases. Architectural explanations shift. Oversized buildings are reinterpreted as symbolic rather than functional. And the giants once casually mentioned become impossible, reduced to fairy tales, biblical exaggerations, or medical oddities. But the frozen bodies undermine all of that, because ice preserves truth too well. Eyewitness accounts from Scandinavia describe bodies emerging from retreating ice fields with clothing styles that didn't match any known local tradition. Garments scaled for frames far larger than the peasants who found them. Some accounts mention tools found nearby, massive iron implements that required multiple men to lift, yet showed wear patterns indicating regular single-user handling. These tools were confiscated. Melt zones were restricted. The discoveries were framed as dangerous distractions during a time of crisis. Survival came first. Questions could wait. And by the time the world stabilized, the questions had no evidence left to cling to. The cold did something else too. It created the perfect excuse. In a world ravaged by famine, plague, and migration, missing bodies did not stand out. Records were lost legitimately. Archives burned. Entire communities vanished. The chaos of the post-1816 years provided cover for the most thorough erasure imaginable. Not through force alone, but through overwhelm. When everything is collapsing, no one asks why certain things are never rebuilt, never mentioned again. And yet the architecture remains. Buildings constructed before 1816 often feature proportions that make no sense for post-1816 humanity. Doorways shrink, ceiling heights lower. Tools become standardized to smaller hands. Furniture scales down. It happens gradually, then suddenly. As if the intended users were no longer present, as if the world was redesigned for a smaller species that inherited spaces it did not originally create. What if the frozen giants weren't explorers or outliers wandering into glaciers by accident? What if they lived there? What if cold-resistant physiology, massive lung capacity, and extreme strength made them suited to environments humans struggled in until the climate crossed a threshold even they could not endure? What if the giants were not myths of the distant past, but neighbors of the recent world, erased not because they were unbelievable, but because they were too real? The ice remembers longer than institutions do. It preserves without interpretation, without ideology, without narrative. Which is why what emerges from ice is always unsettling. Otzi disturbed us, not because he was ancient, but because he was human. The frozen giants disturb us for the opposite reason, because they force us to confront the possibility that humanity was never as uniform as we've been taught, that we were not alone in our own species, and that when the world changed suddenly, violently, and without warning, not everyone made it through. And this is where the bodies disappear. Not all at once, not dramatically. They vanish through custody transfers, mislabeling, sealed archives, and polite academic dismissals. through the simple act of not asking follow-up questions. Because frozen giants do not just challenge biology, they challenge ownership of land, of buildings, of history itself. If giants existed until the 19th century, then many of the structures we claim as our own inheritance were not built for us. And that is a far more dangerous idea than any myth. The winter ended eventually. The sun returned. Crops slowly recovered. Humanity rebuilt. But something else never came back. A presence, a scale, a class of beings whose absence reshaped the world so completely that we now mistake adaptation for origin. We live smaller, not because we evolved that way, but because the world that supported something larger no longer exists. And the ice, slowly melting even now, may still be holding what remains. The question is not whether frozen giants existed after 1816. The evidence suggests they did. The real question is why we were taught to stop looking for them, and what happens if the next thaw reveals something we can no longer explain away. The reason the story ends here is not because the mystery was solved, but because it was sealed. Once the last reports faded, once the final bodies were removed or lost, history didn't correct itself. It recalibrated. New explanations were introduced, quieter ones, safer ones. Giants became metaphors. Architecture became symbolic. Measurements were rounded down. Anything that didn't fit was labeled coincidence, exaggeration, or folklore. And over time, repetition hardened those explanations into fact, not because they were proven, but because they were unchallenged. What remains is a negative imprint, a shape in history defined by absence, oversized doors with no reason, tools too heavy for modern hands, buildings that feel wrong in scale no matter how often we walk through them, newspaper clippings that stop mid-sentence, photographs that vanish between editions. The frozen giants were not erased in one dramatic act. They were erased through attrition, through silence, through the slow discipline of forgetting. And that method is far more effective than destruction, because it leaves no enemy to point to, no moment of rebellion, no single culprit. The year without a summer was the pivot, a natural catastrophe, or something far more complex that reshaped the human story by removing a piece of it. Those who survived adapted, downsized, repurposed a world not originally calibrated for them. And in doing so, they inherited structures, systems, and spaces whose original users were gone. Over time, it became easier to claim authorship than to admit inheritance. Easier to say, we built this, than to ask, who was this built for? The frozen bodies were a problem because they answered too many questions at once. They explained the scale. They explained the architecture. They explained the sudden shift in design, labor, and proportion after the early 1800s. And most dangerously, they suggested that history is not a straight ascent, but a cycle of loss, survival, and selective memory. A story where progress is sometimes just what remains after something greater disappears. So the bodies disappeared. And with them went the last undeniable proof that the world once accommodated something larger than us, not just in size, but in capability. What survived was the shell, the buildings, the myths, the quiet discomfort we feel standing in places that seem to remember a different kind of presence. The ice will continue to melt. It always does. And when it does, it won't ask permission. It won't follow academic consensus. It will simply release what it has been holding. Whether we recognize it, accept it, or erase it again is another matter entirely. Because the most unsettling possibility is not that giants once walked among us. It's that they did so recently enough for the world to still bear their imprint, and that what we call history is not the story of everything that happened, but only the story of what was allowed to remain.